My name is Ellen Carter. I turned 71 tonight, and this is how my birthday ended, with my son snapping the bone in my right arm and locking me in the cleaning closet like I was some dangerous stranger in my own home. The door is only a few inches from my face. There's no window, just the thin yellow glow slipping through the crack near the floor. It's enough to see the angle of my arm, wrong, swollen, already turning the color of wet plums. Every breath shivers through me. The smell of bleach burns my nose, mixing with the dusty scent of old mops. I've spent decades cleaning this house. I never imagined I'd die in a corner of it. Outside, I hear them moving around my kitchen. Plates tapping, cabinets closing, Lila's voice pretending to be soft, pretending to be the soothing one. She lost control again. Dan. Her footsteps drift away like she owns my floors. Maybe she thinks she does. A few hours ago, my neighbor June stood in the same kitchen, laughing while she pushed a single candle into a homemade cake. I can still taste the frosting she smeared on my cheek. I can still hear her humming, "Happy Birthday," off-key and warm. Now the silence between each sound outside the door feels like it could swallow me whole. My son said I needed to calm down, as if calm had anything to do with the way his fingers dug into my wrist before he twisted, as if I imagined finding his wife with my wallet open, my money in her hand. Pain drags me back every time my thoughts drift. I curl around my broken arm and reach into the pocket of my apron. My phone is still there. I don't call 911. I scroll to a name I haven't spoken in years. When he answers, I whisper, "Sam." It's Ellen. My son broke my arm, and I'm not letting them walk away from this. When Sam's voice faded and the call ended, the closet seemed to tilt around me. The pain pulsed hard enough to blur the edges of everything, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I knew that if I let panic take over, I'd lose the only thing I still had, my mind. Clamping down on the fear helped me keep hold of one clear question. How did I let my life reach this point? How did I let them into my house? It takes only a moment for everything in the present to fracture and the past to slip through the cracks. 3 years ago. I was standing at my kitchen counter kneading dough for a small loaf of bread, something I used to do on days when I felt too quiet inside. The afternoon sun spilled across the table, warming the faded wood, and the smell of yeast filled the room. My house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, steady and familiar. I had been living alone for almost 12 years since my husband, Mark, died. Even now, if I closed my eyes, I could still picture the way he leaned on the doorframe when he teased me about overfeeding the neighbors with my weekly baking. That doorframe is the same one my son filled that day, when he came home with a woman I had never seen before. "Mom," he called out in that hopeful voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy. "I want you to meet someone." I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and turned. Dan stood there, shoulders drawn back, chin lifted, like he wanted me to immediately approve of everything about the moment. Beside him, slightly behind him, was Lila. She was 31 at the time, with hair pulled back neatly and eyes too wide to be entirely innocent. She smiled in that polished way people in customer service do, warm, practiced, ready to adjust depending on the reaction. She stepped toward me and held out a container of takeout lasagna. "We didn't want you cooking after a long day," she said. "Dan told me you're always on your feet." Her voice was gentle, but it carried something underneath, a subtle control, like she was introducing herself as the new manager of my own kitchen. Still, I forced a smile and thanked her. I was raised to be polite first, cautious later. That night, we sat around my small dining table. They talked about how they met at a clinic where she worked as a medical assistant, how Dan thought she had the kindest eyes, how she admired his patience and his work ethic. She spoke easily, with small touches on his arm, with those careful glances meant to make him feel chosen. Dan needed that. His divorce had hollowed him out, left him drifting. Seeing him light up again made a part of me unclench. When she excused herself to take a phone call, I leaned in toward my son. "She seems sweet," I whispered. He looked relieved, almost boyish. "She really is. Mom, I think this could be something real." When she returned, she carried herself differently, slower, softer. She asked me about my knee trouble, about living alone, about whether the neighborhood felt safe. She kept tilting her head with concern, her eyebrows knotted just enough to look sincere. I didn't realize it then, but she was mapping the vulnerabilities in the room the way a nurse assesses a patient. A week later, they came back with a box of pastries and a plan already wrapped in kindness. "Your house is big for one person," Lila said as she poured coffee into my favorite mug. "What if we stay with you for a while, just until we save up for a down payment, and we can help with things around the house?" Dan looked at me with those tired, hopeful eyes, and something inside me bent. I thought of the quiet evenings when the TV filled the silence too well, of how I counted the days between Dan's visits, afraid of being a burden if I asked for more company. I thought of being 71 soon and the way the world shifts under older feet. I told them yes. The memory of that moment presses against my ribs every time I think about it. I remember how Dan hugged me, how I felt the weight of his gratitude. I remember how Lila walked through my hallway, tracing the edges of the picture frames with her fingertips, smiling as if she owned the future. They moved in before the end of that month. The house changed quickly, subtle at first. Lila brought candles that smelled like citrus and lemongrass, replacing the lavender ones I'd always used. She rearranged my spice cabinet to make cooking easier. She folded my towels in a different style and commented that my way was cute but outdated. She brought new curtains for the living room and told Dan to take down Mark's old fishing photo, saying it clashed with the new tone of the house. Dan agreed too quickly. I told myself I didn't mind. People adjust. Families grow together. That's what I whispered to myself the night I found Lila neatly stacking my sewing materials into plastic tubs, insisting that the guest room could be so much more useful as our office. Her office, my house. I stood in the doorway, feeling smaller than I had in years. She smiled over her shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Ellen, yet we're making the place feel more like home for everyone." Everyone. Her definition never included me. That was the real beginning, though I didn't know it yet. The first quiet theft was not money, not jewelry, but space. The right to arrange my own belongings, the right to stand at the center of my own life. If I had recognized it then, maybe nothing after that night in the closet would have happened. Maybe my arm wouldn't be broken right now. But back then, all I saw was family, finally filling my empty rooms. I didn't understand how quickly a house could stop feeling like home. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in a series of small shifts, as subtle as dust collecting in corners until suddenly you're choking on it. Lila's presence seeped into everything. Her perfume lingered in the hallway. Her shoes lined up by the door, nudging mine aside. Her voice filled every room with gentle instructions about how things ought to be arranged. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal. People adjust when they live together. But the adjustments all went one direction, and never in mine. One morning, I went into the kitchen and found my spice rack emptied. Cumin, paprika, bay leaves, everything gone. In their place were 4 sleek jars labeled with neat handwriting. When I asked, Lila barely looked up from her phone. She told me she'd simplified things so I wouldn't get overwhelmed. The words stung more than the action. Overwhelmed. As if I'd suddenly become incapable of managing the same kitchen I'd run for 40 years. Dan didn't question it. He just kissed her cheek and thanked her for being thoughtful. I wondered then if I was imagining the changes or overreacting, but the doubts didn't last. Too many little things vanished. The scissors I always kept in the drawer, my favorite mug with the chip near the handle, a blue cardigan Mark bought me for our 30th anniversary, whenever I asked about them. Lila smiled that soft, sorrowful smile and said I must have misplaced them. Dan echoed her. They sounded like a choir singing a song I'd never learned. One afternoon I stepped outside to fetch the mail and found the box hanging open. Letters lay scattered across the porch like someone had rummaged through them. When I bent down, I saw envelopes from my bank already torn. Inside were notices about withdrawals, large ones, from the savings account I rarely touched. I gripped the letters so tightly the paper bent beneath my fingers. I asked Lila if she'd opened them. She didn't blink. She said she wanted to make sure I didn't forget something important, as if rifling through my financial life was a kindness, as if she truly believed I'd hand my future over to her like a set of spare keys. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to think clearly. I'd always handled money responsibly. Mark trusted me with every bill. I still balanced my checkbook every Sunday. So why was my son so quick to assume I was confused? Why did he look at me like a problem to solve instead of a mother to protect? The next morning, I needed a sweater and stepped into my bedroom. I froze. Lila stood in front of my dresser with my wallet open in her hands. It wasn't a vague impression or a trick of memory. I saw the bills inside. I saw her thumb slide across them. When she noticed me, she snapped the wallet shut and put on her sweetest expression, the one she reserved for strangers and manipulation. She claimed she was checking if I'd paid the electric bill. When I pointed out the electric bill wasn't in my bedroom, she simply shrugged and said older people sometimes tuck things into odd places. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. Later that afternoon, once they left for dinner, I walked into their room. My hands shook so badly I had to lean against the doorframe. The top dresser drawer was slightly open. Inside were envelopes packed with cash. My bracelets lay tangled beside them, pieces I hadn't seen in months. There was also a small notebook filled with numbers, dates, locations, amounts. My heart fell into my stomach. I snapped pictures with my phone, trying to keep my breath steady. But even as I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, something deep inside me cracked. Not the clean crack of bone, something quieter, the kind that leaves you hollow. When they returned home, I planned to wait until morning, to gather myself, to speak with facts instead of fear. But Lila must have gone into my room while I was napping. She found the photos. Her voice rang down the hallway. Trembling with outrage she didn't truly feel, calling Dan like she'd discovered a crime. By the time I entered the living room, Dan was holding my phone, disbelief and anger swirling in his eyes. I tried to explain. I told him everything, but Lila pressed her face into his chest, crying about how violated she felt. And Dan, my son, the boy I raised, deleted the photos without letting me finish a sentence. He looked at me with pity. Pity, not love. He told me I must be confused. He said Lila was trying to help me. He said maybe living alone too long had made me forget things. That moment hurt more deeply than any fracture ever could, because that was the first time I realized I wasn't just losing control of my home, I was losing my son. The night everything broke didn't begin like a tragedy. It began with the smell of cinnamon and butter drifting through my kitchen, and June standing at my counter, smoothing frosting over a small round cake with the back of a spoon. She hummed as she worked, the tune wobbling in and out of key, and every now and then she'd look over at me with a grin so wide it made her eyes disappear into soft folds. I remember thinking the house felt lighter with her in it, less haunted, less watched. "You're 71, Ellen," she said. "One candle is all you're getting. I don't want to light the wallpaper on fire." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. We sat at the table eating cake straight from the knife, the frosting too sweet and the crumbs too dry. And for a brief moment, I felt like myself again. But as the sun sank and shadows stretched long across the floor, dread crept back into my chest. I kept glancing toward the driveway, listening for the slam of car doors. They arrived just as June was packing up the leftover cake. The front door opened without a knock, and Lila stepped in first, wearing a crisp white coat from the clinic, her hair twisted into a neat bun. Dan followed behind her, carrying a plastic grocery store cake with a sticker still on the box. He set it on the table without meeting my eyes. "We didn't know you had company," Lila said, smiling thinly at June. "We thought we'd surprise you." June's face tightened, but she kept her voice kind. "I won't stay long, just wanted to bring my girl a birthday treat." Lila's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. How thoughtful. Dan mumbled something like, "Happy birthday, Mom," but he didn't hug me. He didn't even take off his coat. He and Lila stood in my kitchen as if they were visitors, not the people who had taken over every inch of it. When June finally left, she squeezed my hand a little too hard, her eyes lingering on my face as though she sensed a storm brewing. The moment the door shut behind her, the house seemed to inhale sharply. Silence swelled in the room, thick enough to taste. I walked toward my bedroom to fetch the sweater she'd forgotten earlier, but when I pushed the door open, I froze. Lila was there, again, with my wallet open in her hands. This time she didn't even pretend to hide it. The bills were fanned out on the dresser, and my driver's license lay beside them like evidence. "What are you doing?" My voice cracked, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anger. She glanced up slowly, as if annoyed at being interrupted. "I told you, Ellen, you mixed up the grocery money again. I'm sorting it out." I didn't mix up anything. I stepped closer, holding out my hand. "Give me my wallet." She didn't give it back. Not immediately. She lifted her chin in a way that told me she believed she'd already won, that she thought I was too weak, too old, too alone to challenge her. And maybe she was right, until she smirked. That smirk was gasoline on an ember. I grabbed the wallet from her hands, sharper than I intended. She stumbled back, more from surprise than force, but she gasped dramatically, as though I'd shoved her into the wall. "Dan!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the quiet house. "She attacked me!" Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Dan appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I didn't attack her," I said. "She was stealing from me. Again." Lila touched her cheek like she expected to find a bruise. "She pushed me, hard. I almost fell." "I didn't push her," I insisted. "I just took back what's mine." Dan stepped toward me, eyes wide, trembling with a mixture of panic and fury. "Mom, you can't just shove people. You're not well. This isn't normal." The betrayal in his voice stunned me. "I'm not the one who isn't normal," I whispered. "Look around you, Dan. Look at what's happening to your mother." But he wasn't listening. He grabbed my wrist, my dominant hand, and squeezed hard, maybe intending to steady me, maybe intending to restrain me, maybe just lost in the heat of the moment. His fingers dug into bone already thinned by age. I felt pressure, then pain, then a snap so loud it echoed in my skull. For a second, Everything went white. I heard myself scream. I heard Lila gasp. I heard Dan shout my name as though calling it back would undo what he'd done. But the only sound that truly stuck was the wet crunch of my own bone giving way. He dragged me toward the closet beside the kitchen, babbling something about needing to calm down, his voice shaking. I couldn't process the words. I clutched my arm to my chest, dizzy with pain, my legs barely carrying me. He pushed me inside the closet and closed the door. The lock clicked. The darkness swallowed me. I slid to the floor, breathing in the sharp scent of cleaners and dust. My broken arm pulsed with each heartbeat. Outside. Lila's voice floated through the door, soft and sweet, telling Dan he'd done the right thing. My world narrowed to pain, betrayal, darkness. And then, just when I felt myself slipping, I remembered the phone in my apron pocket, my one lifeline, my last bit of power. I pulled it out with shaking fingers. I dialed Sam, and whispering in the dark, I told the truth no one else in that house wanted to hear. The moments after I whispered my name to Sam felt unreal, like the house had tilted on its foundation. He told me to stay quiet, to stay where I was, to keep my phone on. I clutched it like a lifeline. Through the door, I heard his car pull up faster than any ambulance ever could. Then came pounding on the front door, sharp and commanding. Nothing like Dan's frantic shuffling or Lila's staged sweetness. "Open the door." Sam's voice boomed. "Now." Something in its firmness broke through whatever spell they'd wrapped around themselves. I heard Dan fumbling with the lock, heard his shaky, confused apology. Sam didn't respond to him. He walked straight past, found the closet, and swung the door open. The overhead kitchen light poured in like mercy. Sam crouched beside me, his face tightening when he saw my arm. He didn't waste time on shock. He called 911 before Dan could say a word. When the paramedics arrived, Lila tried to interrupt, claiming I'd slipped, that she was so worried about me. But Sam shut her down with a look cold enough to freeze water. At the hospital, the truth began falling into place piece by piece. The doctors noted the angle of the break, the bruising around my wrist, the fear in my voice. They contacted Adult Protective Services. Police officers came to take my statement. I told them everything, from the missing money to the mailbox, to Lila rifling through my dresser, to Dan deleting the photos. June arrived and gave her own account of the shouting she'd heard and the tension she'd sensed for months. Once the investigation began, everything moved quickly. Bank cameras caught Lila withdrawing money using my card. Records showed forged checks. A background search linked her to similar behavior in 2 other states. She was arrested a week later while trying to leave Ohio. Dan showed up at the hospital looking hollow, like someone had scooped the confidence out of him. He kept apologizing, quietly, brokenly. I listened, but the hurt sat heavy between us. The law offered me the option to press charges against him. I didn't, but I didn't comfort him either. Some wounds need time before they can bear the weight of forgiveness. Months passed. My arm healed slowly, stiff on rainy days. Lila went to prison. Her sentence gave me back more than money. It gave me clarity. Dan started therapy, and though things between us remained fragile, we met for coffee twice a month in a small diner where the air felt neutral. As for me, I returned to my home and transformed the closet that once held me captive. I painted the walls soft blue, added a small lamp, a cushioned chair, a bookshelf. It became my refuge, the place where the worst night of my life lost its power. Sometimes I sit there with a cup of tea and marvel at how a single phone call in the dark saved me, and how I saved myself by making it.